Greetings from Microlab Northwest. Today we're going to look at the importance of the sphere of information. Back in 1743, a microscopist by the name of Henry Baker wrote a book called Microscopy Made Easy. And in that book, he cautioned us, he said, assert nothing till examinations in all lights and in all positions. So in other words, you can't just use bright field illumination and think you're seeing all there is to see about the particle. You need to collect what's called the sphere of information. As we look at that beam of light that comes through and strikes the particle, that beam of light excites the electrons in that particle, and those electrons emit light in all directions. We only collect a very small cone of the light that comes through that particle. The sphere of information requires us to look at multiple angles using what Baker referred to as all lights. Right now we're just going to be looking at regular white light. Later on we'll get into more things, but we'll do that in another program. In order to do that, we can't move our particle. We can't rotate our particle. So what we're going to do is we're going to move our illumination. Now we have a nice example, when we were talking about using the ring light to get dark field reflected light. That gives us a lot more information about the particles. Now let's consider a situation in which we're looking at black particles in one single sample of an environment. Now this was a sample out of an office environment, and as we scanned the sample, we found a number of small black, or what appeared to be black, circles. These particles were opaque, not necessarily black. By using reflected light, we could see that these 25 micron size particles were not all the same. You'll notice in the upper left image that that black particle that was in that particular frame of view was actually a blue paint sphere. If we go over and look at the one in the upper right, that particle turned out to be insect frass. That's excrement from a small insect. In the lower frame, we see that we have a magnetite sphere. Magnetite spheres are fairly common in many environments. It's a form of magnetite that's the result of an arc or a spark. Next to that, we have a black cenosphere from a diesel engine. So we have 4 different black particles here, all about the same size, but when we use reflected dark field illumination, we can see they're all entirely different materials from entirely different sources. So the sphere of information, again, is critical. Understanding that we have to look at the particles with different lights, different angles. Now, as we continue, let's take a look at an environmental sample with the reflected dark field illumination. Now, in this particular frame, we have a pine pollen. You can see that here in the lower left corner. Above that, up in the upper left corner, we have an elongated particle that looks white. We'll track that as we go through different types of illumination and see what happens to that. We'll look at a couple of other things, but as we get further into this, we'll show you how we examine those. Now, in order to get different lights For the transmitted beam, we need to have a phase contrast turret condenser. Now, the phase contrast turret condenser is a simple Abbey condenser with a turret. And the turret allows us to drop in different stops in the light path. We'll get some close-up images of that as we go along here. That allows us to collect light from different angles. And we'll look at the light from different angles by using a slide set in clay so that it's upright with some frosted tape on it so that it shows the track of the light coming through on the stage of the microscope. We're looking here at light that's coming through axially. In other words, the substage condenser iris of our turret stage condenser is closed down all the way so that only one narrow beam of light can come through the image. And we can see that here on the right of this image. You can see on the frosted tape, we have just a single beam of light coming through from the substage condenser. When that single beam is coming through, we optimize contrast, but we lose resolution. But another advantage is that we have greater depth of field. In other words, if we have particles at slightly different levels, both of them will appear to be in focus. If we reduce our depth of field, one will become blurry while the other stays sharp, and we'll see that here in a moment. Now let's take a look at that field that we looked at initially with reflected dark field. Now our pine pollen vesicles are black. And you'll notice that the particle up in the upper left that used to be white is now black. What's happened is that the white was the result of light scatter. And light scatter prevents a transmitted light beam from coming through the particle. So it looks black. With axial light, you'll notice our pine pollen is a nice sharp focus, but there's another pollen, another circular pollen that's slightly to the left down toward the bottom. That particular particle we can see with axial light. We can see it's got some structure to it. If we now open up our substage condenser, now we're getting a cone of light coming into our particle. And you can see that again here on the right side with our frosted tape. You can see you've got a cone of light coming up out of the material, out of the particle on the stage. When we do that, we increase resolution. In other words, we can see finer detail in those things that are in sharp focus. But we lose contrast. We don't have as much contrast in the image, as you can see. We also lose depth of field. So the advantage of using a cone of light is the resolving power of the system. We can see finer detail than we could when we were using an axial beam of light. So this is the condition that we normally use when we're examining particles under the microscope so that we can see more detail. But you'll notice with our pine pollen in sharp focus, the small pollen that was on the lower left side is pretty much only indicated as kind of a circle of light. It's not, we lose the detail that we saw when we had an axial beam. Now there's another way that we can illuminate the field, and that's by using oblique illumination. And to do that, we take our substage turret condenser and we rotate it slightly between stops that are built into the scope, or built into the condenser. And at just the right position, we get a beam of light that comes through our particle at an angle. Now, again, here on the right side of this image, you can see that the light is at an angle rather than coming straight through. This narrow beam of light actually maintains high resolution. It maintains depth of field. It retains contrast. So we get all of the advantages that we lost going between axial beam and cone beam by using oblique illumination. The downside of oblique illumination is it does slightly distort the shape of the particles. And we'll see some of that later. Now, when we look at our field of view, the sample that we've been looking at all through this course, we can see that we do still retain resolution. We can see the structure, the fine structure, and many of the particles that are there. We have good contrast. It's easy to see the edges of the particles. And with the depth of field, we can also see some of the detail in that lower pollen grain that we lost when we were using a cone of bright field illumination. So there are a number of advantages to oblique illumination. Another advantage to oblique illumination is that the shading on the particles actually tells us whether the particle has a higher or a lower refractive index relative to the mounting media. We'll see that in another presentation, but that's another advantage that we'll see in the future. Next step is to use dark field illumination. Now, with dark field illumination, again, what we do is we rotate in one of the stops in our phase turret that blocks all the light that can come directly through to our objective. So our background goes black because no direct light can come through. But our particles become bright. One of the advantages of that kind of illumination is that it doesn't make any difference whether your particle is opaque or colored or any other combination of those things. The particle will show up bright. You can see here that we're getting a nice bright image of the fine structure in the pine pollen vesicles. We're getting good information on a number of the particles there. We've got nice bright outlines around the particles showing us edge detail. What we've done by doing this, and it is accomplished in this particular case with a 20x objective, but rotating in what's called the 40x phase stop. That blocks all the light that the 20x objective can collect, but it allows a narrow beam of light to come through outside of that angle to illuminate the particles. And so the light that's refracted, diffracted, or reflected from those surfaces show up. That's why we can see those particles. Now, if we go to what's called the dark field stop on the turret phase condenser here, we're collecting now, instead of a narrow beam of light, what happens is we have the angle that isn't quite collected by the objective, and then we have all of the angles out here. So it's not a very narrow angular exposure. The result is that some of the particles become much brighter than others, and we actually lose some of the detail that we were picking up with the more narrow dark field illumination. The type of illumination that we use is critical in order to see what we want to see, what we need to see in the particles that we're examining. Now, there's a little table here. Some of those things that are indicated, like morphology, the morphology we see with reflected dark field is not the same morphology we see with transmitted axial or with transmitted large angle, bright field, or with oblique illumination. So although those are all marked as sources of morphological information, each one of those different types of illumination gives us different information about the morphology of the particle. If we're going to understand the morphology of the particle, we need all those types of illumination in order to understand the particle, just like Henry Baker told us back in 1743. We're going to be looking at a number of other types of illumination. We're going to be looking at polarized light. We're going to be looking at circular polarized, linear polarized, single polar, crossed polars. Those give us additional information. But we'll do that in another program. This is enough for right now. So long for now. See you next time. And thank you.